Do you find that you lawyer your children?
They lawyer me, actually. I have to say, I may be accused of being slightly inconsistent because I cannot not listen to a good argument. So if you give me a good argument as to why you need a third dessert, I may go for it.
Do you yell objection
No,
in your
but
house?
I do tell my children that what they're saying is not relevant.
History, I'd like to follow me down the rabbit hole. History, I'd like to, frankly, I want to know.
Hey, welcome to HILF. History I'd like to fuck with Dawn Brody. I'm Dawn Brody. And I met my guest, Mary Whiteside, while we were both backlot tour guides at Universal Studios Hollywood, the entertainment capital of LA. And when she suggested the subject of the Supreme Court, I was a bit stymied. I mean, I feel about the legal system like I think some others feel about history. It's all just a little dark, a little depressing, and just too damn hard to understand sometimes with the dates and the names and the precedents and an amicus, which is why I immediately said yes. Because Mary is not just a guest with a curiosity about this stuff. She fucks with the law. She's a real lawyer and a mom and funny and cool and so smart. And this episode is a blast. Before we jump in, though, I do want to send out a general high five because we just passed our 1 year HILFiversary. Yay! We dropped our first episode a year ago. And since then, we have had such a blast probing the anals and meeting so many of you. So thank you for listening. It means the world. We intend to keep it up and keep going down. Please rise, you heard me, for episode 25, The Supreme Court. We think lawyers don't do backlot tours.
Right. Why would you
do that?
Be a tour guide? Okay, well, you have to think about why I became a lawyer. So my mother desperately loves security. So the idea of being an actress was terrifying to her. How would you have health insurance? You know?
Right.
She couldn't have fathomed Obamacare at the time. And so I was like, okay, well, can't be risky. So I guess trials are kind of like little plays. So I'll do that. And then I did, and I got to do trials, and I was like, oh, this is terrible.
But isn't there like law school in between? Like,
no. And I was a history major.
You were?
And I took these great classes like Inside the Soviet Secret Police and Hitler's Germany and England and Ireland and all this great stuff. And then I got to law school, and it was like torts, property. And I wanted to quit. I wanted to quit after my first year, and I should have, and I didn't. Oh. Not because I'm not good at it, but just because it's just not really like a perfect fit. It doesn't challenge all of my whole facet as a person.
So what kind of trial lawyer were you?
I did criminal defense.
You were a criminal defense lawyer. See that? Okay, now, and you know, I mean, this has to be something you deal with all the time. That all we know is Law and Order. Was there anything that was kind of like Law and Order? Were there any days? Did you ever yell objection?
Of course you had to yell objection. But no, I had this great case where they accused my client of having an illegal weapon, these Chinese throwing star. And it was like basically kind of like a pocket knife that had 4 blades that you could open up. And he had prior criminal charges, so he wasn't supposed to have this. And it was like on a mantle in his house. Like it was a decoration. Yeah. So I had gone to look at this artifact, this piece of evidence, and I opened it up and I touched the blades, and they were dull. They hadn't been sharpened. And my whole defense was that this is a decoration. He had like Asian themed apartment decor, you know. So I hedged a bet that the DA hadn't touched it to find out that they weren't sharp. So I'm like, well, how can this be a weapon if otherwise it'd just be like throwing a mug across the room at somebody, and that's not why these things are illegal. So I saved it till closing argument, and I thought that the judge wasn't going to let them take it back because it's a weapon, right? That's what they say. And so I'm like, when you get to look at this, you will find out that it's not even sharp.
Whoa.
And I like, you could rub it on your face, you could rub your finger on it. And I did this whole big thing. And I had worn like this Asian themed suit, and I had origami crane earrings, and I did my makeup up because I think about these things. And just to be like, you present yourself.
Yeah.
That's what he was presenting, his theme. And this wasn't a weapon. Anyway, we won the trial, but that was my favorite.
Oh, Mary!
And the judge was like, I wasn't gonna let him take it back, but the way you said it, I couldn't not.
These are their stories.
And I had this amazing transformative experience when I was a baby lawyer, and we went to lawyer camp. So it was half trial attorneys, like experienced trial attorneys, and half acting coaches, and so we would be like,
there were so many hand jobs at lawyer camp.
Not by me, but maybe I I have a great story, but I'm not going to tell it because it wasn't me, but it was so good. Anyway, then they had actors come in and play our clients.
Okay.
So, and you would be, you'd be working on your closing arguments, your opening arguments, and then you'd go to another session, you'd be crawling on the floor, growling like a dog, and, and then it would be like a storytelling one. And I'm telling you, it awoken this stuff in me because I'd wanted to be an actress. I'd wanted to do that. And one of the acting coaches pulled me aside and he's like, you're really good at this. And I was like, oh, thanks so much.
I kind of know.
And then I didn't lose a jury trial after that because I could, my jury selection was so much better. I could relate to people more. I could paint a picture. It was really great. It didn't make me love practicing law anymore.
Yeah.
It just opened up my eyes into like, oh, actually entertainment is a world that people live and work in.
Yeah.
And then I wanted to get to that place.
And you're still a lawyer, but now you're a lawyer who wants to be an actor and still a lawyer, or wants to be a lawyer until you don't have to be a lawyer anymore.
I mean, that's the truth.
Right? And you also have a great podcast that I love, May It Displease the Court. You can find it on Spotify. It is really, really fascinating. She has great guests. She's a great interviewer. And I learned a lot about law because I told you, I've never been arrested. I've never been in court. I've never even been on a jury. All I know is what I know from TV. And that it's just kind of fucked, that it's fuckery in general.
I really want to bring the law to people so that this is not a podcast for lawyers, although they're welcome to listen to it. I love it, but it's a way to kind of bring people into the world, again, like you, who maybe they haven't been on a jury, or they are lucky enough not to be in segregated, surveilled communities, so they're not pulled over all the time, and they don't have these interactions. They haven't been sued, so they just don't understand how much law actually affects their everyday life, and how much the system has been designed and to privilege certain people, and that's how it works. And we have these grand concepts of justice and liberty and fairness, but what really goes on, and what's the power play? As a political science and history major from college, I kind of bring that like systemically, what is going on behind the scenes? Where are the power players? That's what I like to look at.
You assigned me this book, and it's called Injustices, The Supreme Court's History of Comforting the Comfortable and Afflicting the Afflicted by Ian Millhiser. And one of the things you said was great about starting with this book is it's really readable. For like, I didn't need to know a lot. He definitely is speaking to people who are like, what is that? And defines amicus and things like that, which is helpful. Sometimes reading this book was like watching Michael Myers sit up behind Jamie Lee Curtis.
Yeah.
Where you're just like, bitch, you don't have any fucking clue.
Right. I know.
How bad it's going to get. Anyway, but thank you. So thank you for the nightmare fuel. That is Injustices. Why did you recommend this book to me?
Well, I thought it was great for you because he doesn't just like, it's not a book for lawyers. So he goes through the history and the context of, of how the cases have gone over time and how the court as an institution has worked much more for powerful, rich sources. And while we have these grand ideas of equality and due process, they bend over backwards to help rich people, and they ignore these principles that are written into the law.
Yeah.
And he brings all of that out, and he fleshes it out, and he tells a story like a great storyteller. He contextualizes it. So you can see, it's like when you think about these principles kind of in the abstract, or just, without the context of the unionization and the, what the working conditions were like that led to people even trying to form a union, and why all of this is necessary, and then why management comes in and tries to crush it, So he paints all of those pictures, and dark history and dark law and all that, it's really fascinating. So I mean, if you're somebody who doesn't like to get bored and likes to get a little bit outraged every now and again, it's a great thing to kind of get into, because you can get kind of pissed off about it, and you can see how, oh my gosh, this is happening again.
What I'm going to do is just try to give a really just brief, quick overview of the origin of the Supreme Court, and a very basic discussion of what in the ideal world they were intended to do, and how we even started. Then Mary, a bona fide motherfucking lawyer, is going to tell us about who she thinks were the best and the worst individuals to have served on the Supreme Court in history. I am so excited to hear your take on that. And then I was going to do the same thing. Originally, I was like, I'm going to also find my best and worst, but I feel completely unqualified to do that. I read about them all, and every time I'd read one, I'd be like, that guy's the worst. And I'd be like, no, wait, this piece of shit right here. McReynolds, what a cunt, right?
Oh my gosh.
Oh my God.
Like the worst human being.
The worst. And then I found myself getting really modern, which was fine, which is great. But I was like, I'm going to leave that to Mary. So I was like, you know what? I am going to arouse you all with a dark tale from the deepest bowels of some of the darkest criminal history in America. But there's hope. But I promise this is dark and sad, and it really makes, everybody's a cunt in this one. But there's hope at the end. I promise. Are you ready to fuck, Mary?
I am ready.
What happens if you ever started a court case with "Let's fuck, Your Honor"?
Probably a contempt warning, I would think. I noticed, I'm a fan of your podcast, and I noticed that some guests get offered whiskey and bourbon, and I was offered pastry and tea.
Yes.
And you're absolutely right. That is me 100%. But I did note the difference.
No, well, actually, it was because I was ready to get there. I said, we have coffee or tea, and I was ready to give you a list, and you were like, tea, hot tea, big cup.
Okay, yeah.
But do you want some whiskey?
No.
Because I also offered you some cannabis.
You did. You did. I forgot that.
You can have anything you see in this place is yours.
Yogurt?
Yeah, if you can catch him. He can be a slippery little sucker. All right, so we are going to fuck the history of the Supreme Court, and I'm going to start with, how we got there. So 1776, a lot of people say, is America's birthday. It's fair. It's a very exciting year. It is, however, of course, the year we declared our intent to be independent from Britain. I'm a mom now. My daughter tells me all the time she's a grown-up. She declares all sorts of shit, and it doesn't actually mean anything, because 7 years later, we win the war. In 1783, the United States is the United States. America, we are separate from Britain, and it's, again, similar to a kid getting their independence. You're like, yeah, we fucking did it. Oh, fuck, right? Because we knew what we didn't like, but now we have a ton of fucking debt. We have all these divided states. We have to figure out how to get the money we need to pay for shit from a bunch of people who just decided we don't get taxed. We got to figure out our commerce and our security and who now is going to attack us because we don't have the protection. I mean, it was a fuck show, right? And it took a minute to figure out how we were going to do things differently than the system we just bucked off. That 4-year period of time is called the Confederacy. Not to be confused with the Southern Confederacy, but they did love that. That was sort of the time before the Constitution, before we decided to put all these laws in place. Because in 1787, the famous guys, you know them all, they have white hair. You probably played them in some elementary school play. We get the Constitution, and one of the things in the Constitution is the establishment of our 3 branches of government and the checks and balances. And those branches are the legislative branch, which is your senators, your congress people. They are Congress at the highest point. They, among other things, make the laws. They write the laws. Then you have the executive branch, president, vice president. I read 4 million people work under the executive branch.
Wow.
That seemed like a lot.
It does seem like a lot.
The top, of course, is the president. That individual can, of course, pass or veto the laws that your legislative branch sends to them. And the judiciary is the branch that then determines, interprets the Constitution, and evaluates these laws when they come up to question. The Supreme Court, of course, is the highest. They generally do the big shit, the federal stuff between states, things that are appealed and pushed up the line. And the difference is president appoints judges, the Congress approves them, but they get them lifetime terms, which is problematic. It's the closest thing to royalty we have in the United States is our Supreme Court, because they serve until they dead, or they don't want to anymore. And one of the things that the Supreme Court does in their thing is interpret the Constitution. And some of the things that these friends have to interpret is what the Founding Fathers intended. Do you ever struggle with that idea, Mary? What was the intent? That has to be one of the hardest.
I actually don't care what their intent was, because most of them were slavers.
Yes.
They did not care to give women a voice.
No.
So I'm interested, kind of in how it went, but I don't think it's the be all and end all for me in constitutional interpretation.
And I guess you'd have to figure out whose intent you meant, because there's sort of this idea, I think, when we talk about the intent of the Founding Fathers, that they were ever a truly unified group. Yeah. In addition to being kind of bastards on an individual scale, was the fact that they were not at any point truly unified. We have the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists. These are our Founding Fathers against each other. The Federalists includes Washington and Alexander Hamilton. And then you have the Anti-Federalists, which is Jefferson and Madison. And they are super ideologically different. And and you please jump in at any point, Mary. Correct me, please. Jesus, correct me. Do not let me run with the dumb stuff. But here's how a simpleton like me sort of understands the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists in this early 1780s division, is they all agreed we can't have another king. Tyrants are the worst. And lowercase italics, freedom is the best. On that point, they agree. The Anti-Federalists are saying the federal government is that tyrant. The strong federal government is the tyrant that we are all afraid of. And the Federalists are saying, the federal government is the only thing that can keep the tyrants down. And this is okay because our federal government has the balance in these three branches. So it can't be the tyrant, but it's the only force strong enough to keep the tyrants down. And they back and forth forever to today.
Till today.
And what these, so they have to, so the first thing, we have to interpret, what did the Founding Fathers intend? Who fucking knows? And which Founding Father?
Right.
Or do you want to try to imagine that they all held hands at some point and delivered some unambiguous intent? Neither of these things are true. Do you feel in that general history that I have missed or omitted any important element to get us on a founding footing?
Well, I think there's this mythology about the judicial branch that is important to understand. Is the reason that they were, the theoretical reason that they were given lifetime appointments was to remove them from the political process, make them quote unquote independent, so that with this idea that their independence could then allow them to do justice, right, even if justice was something that the people would be against. And a lot of times you'll see Brown versus Board of Education being an example of this happening, pushing desegregation when everybody didn't want that.
Right.
But this idea is more mythology than it is reality. I mean, judges are not apolitical, and the current Supreme Court is anything but.
Yeah.
And so this exploitation of a lifetime appointment with this kind of, but they're apolitical, is why we're in this pickle.
Please start with the good news.
The good news?
Let's give us the shot in the arm, and let's start with the Supreme Court justice that you have deemed the best.
Okay, so I will say, I know this is a history podcast, but I have to say my best Supreme Court justice is Justice Sonia Sotomayor.
Right on.
I think she is pretty great, though no one is perfect. And,
no.
And I have a slight criticism of her, but for the most part, I think that she's really great. And I think she's great for a lot of reasons. She comes from a more working class regular background. She's the first woman of color and Hispanic Latina on the Supreme Court ever.
Nice.
She was born in the Bronx,
Right on.
Puerto Rican.
Right
Her
on.
parents are Puerto Rican. Obama nominated her, and she's been on since 2009. She also, a little bit of history about herself. Like she was diagnosed with diabetes, type 1 diabetes at 7. So she understands what it's like to have working class parents, have serious medical condition. Her dad died at 42. He, was like a factory guy and I think an alcoholic. So, she came up and she lived in housing projects in the Bronx. She came up through education. Her mom really valued education. She was valedictorian. She went to where'd she go? Princeton and Yale Law School. So, she knew she wanted to be a judge right when she was a little girl, like by 10 years old. Lucky her. She was like, I want to be a lawyer.
See, not like Mary. Mary was
No.
like, I don't fucking like this stuff that much, but I'll do it to pay my rent. And Sonia was like, I'm going up. I'm going all the
doing
way.
this. And she got into Princeton, in part because of affirmative action. She admits that. She owns that. She, her standardized test scores weren't incredible compared to the rest of her resume. So that the fact that there was affirmative action helped her get into these great schools. And, obviously you can see through her life and, reading her jurisprudence, like she's very intelligent. So, she credits that as being something that was necessary to get to her where she is. And, I really like the fact that she brings this perspective because she will pay more attention and she cares more about criminal defendants, people on death row, and, regular average people. It's not just all about the money, the money, the money, the money. She writes these really researched and well-argued dissents. Unfortunately, she's in the dissent most of the time. And she leads in areas of, criminal justice where I think a lot of people would imagine, like Ruth Bader Ginsburg, she is this liberal icon. And unfortunately, she falls a little bit short. And where she falls short, Sotomayor was there leading, dealing with issues with criminal justice. I feel like RBG kind of let me down a little bit. At the end of the Trump administration, they were rushing to, when he, it was coming up, it's like from July to the end of the term, they were rushing to kill as many people on death row as they possibly could.
I remember that, yeah.
It was kind of crazy. And they were, so people, when you're on, death row, you have to get through your appeals and they can't execute you until you've, gone through the process. And these last few months, they executed more people than they had in 60 prior years.
Whoa. Holy Hannah.
Yeah, so it was really
Just clear up death row.
killing spree. Just, yeah.
Holy shit.
And so they would run to the Supreme Court, these last minute appeals, and they would also have to go to the district court, and then like the Fifth Circuit or the 11th Circuit, the Circuit Court of Appeals, and then it would go to the Supreme Court. And a lot of these defendants had credible claims that the lower courts are like, yeah, we need to look at that. We need to look at his mental health status. We need to look at the quality of the evidence. We need to look at prosecutorial misconduct, the religious issues, free speech. And they were like, we want to have hearings, let's do this. And then they would do these emergency stopping the lower court from going through these fact-finding processes and saying, oh, no, we're going to be, the government say, well, we're going to be irreparably harmed, and we have to do this very fast. And it would get all the way, and they would push it all the way up from the district court to the appellate court to the Supreme Court. And then the Supreme Court was just very quickly, oh, yep, kill him, without writing decisions, without letting the lower courts do the fact-finding. And so she wrote this, at the end of this, she wrote this dissent where she went through this about how this wasn't justice, that these people, they weren't giving meaningful hearing of their very, credible legal claims. Maybe they wouldn't have all won, but maybe some would have. And instead, the court just stopped that process so that they could be killed quicker. And she named all of the different people that had been, executed in the prior, 6 months. It was like 13 people that they were just boom, 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 boom. And I really respect her going through that because, it's something that's not a group of people on death row that's like people care about them the least.
Sure.
They are the margin of the
Yeah.
margin of the margins.
Dissent's got to be fucking juicy. Like, it is essentially a like, fuck this and fuck you and here's why and how much fun to write. But it's also work. And like, these guys got lifetime appointments. Like, you don't got to get up and write a dissent if you don't want to. Like, you could just go play racquetball and then go to work later. Like, you can never be fired. You're creating work for yourself. So for her to make a point of dissenting on behalf of already executed individuals who were found guilty at some level and were on death row, I can see why that is an admirable characteristic.
She's putting that out there for future generations to take up. And, it is, you're right, it's a ton of work. And she's been doing that also. And when I was talking about them rushing through and asking for these emergency stays, it's called it's kind of, I don't know if it's an official name, but we call it the shadow docket of the Supreme Court.
Ugh.
And it's a situation where there are emergency applications. They're not fully briefed. They don't write these decisions. The court doesn't often write decisions explaining why they're making a decision. They're going through their legal analysis. They don't even necessarily attribute who voted which way. So it's really what they call it shadow because you just don't know.
The shadow docket.
The shadow docket. And it's because it's justice, but it's cloaked in secrecy, which is not how it's supposed to be. And what's going on is more and more cases at the Supreme Court, they are either granting or ignoring cases and not allowing them to go all the way up through this chain where they get developed. The Supreme Court is, ignoring lots of things that, they should hear. They get about 10,000 petitions. They hear maybe 80 cases. And 4 justices have to agree to hear a case. So when the court ignores these petitions that she would grant, a lot of times she has been writing dissents about that to let people know, hey, this was extreme lawlessness, this is terrible police conduct, and we're just not even going to take the case. And so then it's over. If the Supreme Court won't take the case, it's done.
Yeah.
So it's like a death. It's like a death of the case.
Have her dissents since Roe and in the recent years become more pointed, more she's just always on the loose.
No, she did. She said, there was one to quote, when they were talking about juveniles being sentenced to life without parole, she's like, the court is fooling no one. She called with Roe. She said the stench of this, will not dissipate. So she's using stronger language, to say, this is really, they're not following precedent. They're bound by no precedent, not bound. Precedent is their prior decisions. So the court should decide the same way it's decided before on the same issue, unless something changes and there's a real solid legal reason to change it. Right. They
like prohibition. This was one when I did the episode on prohibition. It was so quickly adopted and therefore very easily to be quickly dismantled. But other than prohibition, there haven't been a lot of quick reversals. Or am I wrong about that?
No, I don't think so. And if you look at Roe, that was they were coming for that from the beginning.
Yeah.
Yeah. But there was no legal reason to change precedent.
Right.
They just decided the composition of the court changed.
Right.
Therefore, the ruling changed.
Have you told us all of the best stuff about Sonia Sotomayor? She's living history. So her best is very likely, to come. But here's what I want to know.
Okay.
Why do you remain optimistic? Do you remain optimistic? And you're still working within this system every day. What is it that motivates you to do that?
Well, there are avenues available for reform, and I think that we got to fight for that. That's your job wherever you are, to fight to make it better. So we can advocate to expand the Supreme Court. The number of justices have changed throughout the years. So they can change again. We've been, these...
I got it here. We got, in 1789, there were 6. 1807, there were 7. 1837, there were 9. 1863, right after the Civil War, we were like 10. And then we're like, that's too many. So then in 1866, we went back to 7. And then in 1869, we went back up to 9. And we've been hanging out at 9 ever since. And all the reasons them numbers changed up and down throughout the years was in part because of who was being represented. The idea that we have been expanding this country. We've got all these new regions and all of these new demographics that need representation. So the court needs to get bigger so that we have a larger representation on the court. It has been discussed now. I did find in this book that when the last president that actively said, I'd like to expand the Supreme Court, maybe even up to 15, was Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who's absolutely, without question, the most popular American president in history. He was the only one. He went through World War II. He was elected to 4 terms. I mean, he's the guy. He could kind of do whatever he wanted, including crazy reaches of power that like no other president was able to do without crazy criticism. And he kind of mentioned he might want to expand the court up to 15, and he was hosed. People were like mad and they wrote nasty ass letters, and he said it was like he got stung big time for even suggesting it, because on its surface it looks like a very broad stroke to just fix what's in your way. It does look like the president, who does have the appearance and is often at times the individual, the kingliest like king person. And if they are just saying, I want to do this one thing for my benefit, it's easy to target a tyrannical accusation on that kind of thing. And he was absolutely like, yeah, I want to do it because I want to get all this New Deal shit done. And I don't think I can do it with the Supreme Court I have. So I'm going to change the Supreme Court. And yes, but when you actually have a legitimate argument for this court does not accurately represent the population, what do you do?
Well, I think, when you look at who appointed, Republican or Democrat, most of the appointees have been from Republican presidents. They haven't won a popular election since the 80s.
Right.
So, they already have an outside voice based on the way the Senate is run and based on the Electoral College. And so then you add this imbalance to the Supreme Court, and you really run the risk of giving that the majority voters in America don't have a say in how they're governed most of the time. So that's an argument for expanding the Supreme Court, because it has this. Also, Mitch McConnell brought it down to 8 when he refused to let Obama fill it. Right.
That's right. We were living with 8.
Yeah. So, that's
and
another time.
And that didn't seem to be a huge problem.
Right. That wasn't a problem for him.
Right.
The argument is, well, if a Democratic Congress expands the number of seats, then when there's a Republican Congress, they could just do it again and back and forth and back and forth. But I think you need to look at you have to understand the Federalist Society, what its role is, the huge, enormously rich secret donors that have inserted themselves into American politics and into the judiciary and into funding these, since Citizens United allowed this unlimited dark money spending by anonymous donors. You have to look at that in terms, and the public has to understand what's going on before they can understand why we can't just allow the Supreme Court to rule over us, and they can strike down. They'll be striking down legislation, anything that the executive branch does that they don't want, that they don't like, that doesn't comport with what their donors' goals are. Because you can look at, and Senator Whitehouse has looked at Republican donor goals and the lawsuits associated with them and the win rate, and they are undefeated. Mm-hmm. So, that's a clear evidence that, there's a real agenda that they're pushing.
Yeah.
And we don't have to accept that.
The first thing they always tell us, especially plebes like me, is if you don't have a lot of money and you don't have a lot of time, then, the bare minimum you can do is vote, and then also tell other people how you want to vote and how they should vote. And that's the best. And you go, yes, 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 yes. And then your heart is just broken, because then the world is like, fuck, these fucks are also coming after the vote. Your vote doesn't matter. Your vote doesn't count. When you live in a place like California, you're just screaming into this big liberal bubble that doesn't matter. Whereas if you are in other states, your voice is actually heard more. And so I feel like it can be so heartbreaking and so easy to just say the bastards have won. I'm either going to move into a cabin in the woods or I'm going to burn it all down. And the truth is actually slightly more optimistic and slightly more tragic than that, which is you can make a difference, but it is going to be small, incremental, and may not develop the fruit you're looking for in your lifetime. And that is why this subject does fit so well in a history podcast, because that is how history always works. We are these sad little skin sacks that get to live, if we're fucking lucky, 80 years. Right? And as we know, the movements of history are often significantly slower than that. So it can always be the issue for a cognizant human being looking at the lifespan that they have and the lifespan of the world to feel like you're devastatingly under some Zamboni of like the movement of time that you can do nothing. And it's like, you're right and you're wrong. You're absolutely right and you're absolutely wrong. And you will, with your ripples, change the course of history. But yeah, you may never fucking see it. And you might find that you live in a time of terrific darkness. And it's going to take flipping through the pages of a previous time to find the light you're looking for. And that's maybe where we come in. And we have more coming up. When we come back from the break, my friend Mary is going to tell us, you told us who you thought was the best and it was still kind of a dark fuck show. But now when we get back from the break, you're going to tell us about who you think is actually the worst Supreme Court justice in the history of a bunch of assholes. So look forward to that. I am going to give you whiskey. I feel like you've deserved it.
Awesome.
Hi, I'm Hal Loveland.
And I'm Mark Gagliardi.
And we're the hosts of We Got This with Mark and Hal, the weekly show where we settle the debates that are most important to you.
That's right. What arguments are you and your friends having that you just can't settle?
Apples or oranges?
Marvel or DC?
Fork versus spoon?
Chocolate or vanilla?
Best bagel?
What's the best Disney song?
We Got This with Mark and Hal. Every week on Maximum Fun, we do the arguing so you don't have to.
Oh, all answers are final for all people for all time.
We got this.
Hey, before we go back to court, a reminder that you can head to Instagram and see pictures and links to the stories and people we talk about at HILF Podcast. And there you can also take the quiz. Like, do you know your rights? Do you know what habeas corpus means? You want to show us your jurisprudence? Well, you can when you...
Follow me, follow me, follow me, follow. Follow me, follow me, follow me, follow.
Being around judges, it's the closest thing you ever get to like being around kings, because they have their own chambers and they have their own people that work for them and their own like deputies that work for them, and whatever little idiosyncrasies the judge has, that everybody hops to.
Have you ever had a desire to be a judge
I
yourself?
was actually recruited. I was a judge I liked. The judge I really liked. I thought wasn't changed as a person by being on the bench, and that even the best of the best, most of them are changed as people by the power. Yeah. But he truly wasn't. And yeah, he was talking to me about it, and I was just kind of like, I don't know. I really, at the end of the day, I don't want my legacy being how many people I put in jail or prison.
Yeah.
And you do a lot of that.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah.
And you're not always going to know what it is. And you have mandatory minimums and mandatory sentencing. And I think the system, you perpetuate a system that's deeply unequal.
And you have to campaign.
And you have to campaign. And you have to pay your own money.
No, thank you.
Being in the courts and seeing that kind of political stuff go around, it was interesting.
So do you think, because this is, I think, a question when you get to like, who wants to be a judge? Like, who wants to be a cop? And you like to imagine that there are altruistic, really good-natured, good-meaning people that are like, I want to be at this high level so that good people like me are at this high level. I want to help and I want to influence. And I'm looking at my friend Mary, who's a good person, who was just like, absolutely not. I couldn't be a judge because yuck. Those people have to do all the bit, And I fear, as I think a lot of people fear, that the only individuals who are then drawn to these levers of power are the assholes. How do you and how does one draw good motivations out of people in these positions and draw people with good motivations to these positions?
Well, I think you can do a lot with ethics and accountability. So you can give them standards. And if we look at the Supreme Court, they don't have any ethical standards that they're required to follow. That's a problem. So
They don't even have to take off their shoes when they come in. They don't have to wash their
Nothing.
hands after they pee.
No,
They
can
don't have to do anything.
feces-covered hands.
They could be grabbing that gavel with salmonella.
Absolutely.
Nothing to stop them.
So, I think a strong code of ethics that you're required to do full financial disclosures and transparency, including your close relations. They also should be required so that we just know you're not getting anything for other than your salary. You're not receiving other benefits.
Right.
And, if you are receiving benefits, who are they from? Just transparency in that. I think that takes away, the darkness where things can kind of grow and mold.
Objection, Your Honor.
Speaking of the darkness and the worst inclinations of judges, this seems like a good way to get us into Mary's pick for the all-time worst Supreme Court judge of all time.
Okay, again, I apologize for the recent history, but it's Clarence Thomas.
You had no doubt about that.
I don't. I
And
haven't
girl,
had a
I'm
big doubt.
telling you, this book, man, there are some real pieces of shit in there.
And I will
can't
say-
wait to hear about why Clarence
I
Thomas
think
is your pick.
there may be some recency bias from just the fact
Also,
that
he
I'm living
stands
through
on
it.
the shoulders of ogres.
Exactly. So he is certainly as bad as the worst of the worst justices in the books. So he has not all of it, but he has a lot of their own terrible qualities and some of his own.
Great.
So I dislike Clarence Thomas the most. I don't think he ever should have gotten on the Supreme Court. Had Me Too happened earlier, perhaps if we believed credible women, or even really took a great interest in investigating their claims, which is the bare minimum, we may not have Clarence Thomas, and he may not have paved the way for Brett Kavanaugh.
Considered especially heinous.
So there's that. I could go through his decisions. He is the most extreme right-wing conservative, ideologically very anti anything that I believe in. He also was super poor. So, but he reacted to it in a different way than Sotomayor. So he also was he also came up through, upper tier Ivy League schools through affirmative action. But his experience of it was very different. And I think probably it's sincere. I think he was treated like garbage because if you look at him, he's very dark. He's a very, very dark black man. And I absolutely believe that he was treated like garbage and that he was told he was only there because of affirmative action and that he hadn't earned his place. His reaction to that, which is wrong, terrible, scarred him, traumatic, I'm presuming, and I can have deep sympathy for that. But his reaction is to embrace this idea of everyone gets to pull themselves up by their own bootstraps. And I was kind of raised in this purple upstate New York, so I kind of, believed in this meritocracy, in my own little bubble. And, when you get out into the world, especially working, as a defense attorney, I encountered people that just blasted that notion right out of the water. I had a client who had every disadvantage that I could think of. His parents were of low intelligence, low IQ, as was he. He was sexually abused, poor, extremely poor, mental illness. He had physical abuse, emotional abuse in the system, is neglect, all of the things, everything. Substance abuse. I mean, I really couldn't come up with a single, severe mental illness, a single thing that could happen to a person terrible that hadn't happened to him. And he had, a really awful life, But I thought to myself, well, would I have done any better given all of these? I know how hard it is to break a seemingly small bad habit with the ability to get mental health treatment or not having, and having a normal or above IQ, how hard that is. What would it be like to have none of those things? And it was like, okay, so there just were no bootstraps for him. You know, how can I really, judge where he ended up?
Yeah. Well, there's always that pull yourself up by your bootstraps. You're like, you got boots.
Right. Right.
With straps.
And Clarence Thomas, with these extreme conservative views, he kind of, as a black man, it's kind of like, well, he's, see, it's a black man saying it. So he gives kind of cover for the majority of people who, hold these same type of extreme beliefs.
It's fascinating reading this book, knowing that we have Clarence Thomas on the Supreme Court and that he is one of the most conservative justices we've ever had. When the vast majority of this book really covers the extent to which the courts went to keep African Americans legally and technically defined as beneath the white race, as how much white supremacy was really baked in. So much so that it started to actually make sense to me, because Clarence Thomas is a black man, which on the surface makes you say, of course, he would be the iconic thing they were afraid of, a black man on the Supreme Court. But he is towing the line with so much more vigor that if you are poor, it's because you fucked up, because there's something wrong with you or wrong with your family. There is some sort of natural selection to poverty, that the way that the people are suffering is not a result of bad government, but a result of their suffering. And what right do we have to limit someone's ability to take from them that which they feel is theirs? So Clarence Thomas, he is appointed by George Bush. Am I right?
The first.
George Bush the first. George H.
The first of his name. Yes.
The first of his name. So after Clarence Thomas is appointed, and through the sexual abuse scandal that permeated his appointment, after he's appointed, what has his judicial life been like since his appointment?
Well, he spent a lot of time in the dissent, because they didn't, the balance of the court was different, and he was the most extreme. So I'm talking really extreme. Like, he is fine with child labor. He's like cool with that. That's good. My son was given this book about the children in the mines.
The Breaker Boys?
It's like digging a hole to heaven. That's the title of this book. I'm like, right? I'm like, this is gonna be so dark. And it's this great, you would love it actually. It's this great history, and it brings him, and he's like, wait, these are kids my age, and this was what was allowed back then. And so it's this great understanding of what child labor really looked like.
So tell me how Clarence Thomas would even be speaking to child labor when this is a decision that was decided long before he came to the Supreme Court.
Well, you have cases that come up periodically that deal with child labor. There was one with Nestle that recently came up, I think last term or the term before, where they were contracting with different farms that had child slaves. Yeah. So the issue comes back again and again throughout, and that's through different cases throughout time. And so he would have the opportunity to be like, well, actually, I think it's fine that, there's nothing that prevents blah, blah, blah. He wouldn't say it's fine for children to be used.
And and there's always that, like, I may abhor child labor. It was interesting in this book to see how many times justices would say how proud they were that they personally hated this decision, how proud they were that they were going to have a hard time sleeping for the rest of their lives, because the very disdain they had for the law they just passed proved they weren't biased, because they hated it and they passed it anyway, because they were really, really, really sticking to the law. And that's why you should know I'm a good guy, because I stuck. And it's like, you can kind of hear that in Clarence Thomas when he talks about child labor, because it's like, I may abhor child labor. He doesn't exactly say that, but he says, but it's another country's practice, and the United States doesn't have jurisdiction over them. And so who are we to tell a company they won't be able to compete if they can't go? And technically and legally, that is absolutely sound. And then they get a clap on the back for being willing to really stomach that horrible child labor thing for the right cause,
right,
for doing the right thing. You're a really noble individual. Ugh.
I know. It's really complicated, because it's like, in some ways, do you want them to be ideologically driven? Do you not want them to be ideologically driven? Is it just the different ideology? I mean, I do think that those are pretty important topics to be talking about if any of that stuff was out in the open. If it was an open discussion as opposed to just like, well, we're going to look at the history of what happened in the past and what these founders used to say, and that's what I'm basing my decision on, when that's not really what you're basing your decision on. It's really how you feel about something or what you think about something. But acknowledging that is something that the law doesn't want to do. They don't want to say that that's really what's going on, when it seems pretty clear that it always has been.
Right.
Thomas, he very pro death penalty. I mean, he can't kill them fast enough. He doesn't care if the jury was racist, if the lawyer was incompetent, if the prosecution withheld exculpatory evidence. He's all about the process. And if you happen to find evidence of your innocence too late, had too much time had passed since your trial, forget that. I mean, he just really is just all about the process and upholding the conviction. It's rough, you know. Thomas
rough out there.
And so he was always all alone on those, and now he's got, you know, some friends to join him in this, and so we've had this huge shift to the right. So where he used to kind of write these like screeds that, you know, was him on his own, now the Overton window has moved, and he has, you know, Barrett and Kavanaugh and Gorsuch, and so Roberts can kind of come and go as he pleases and doesn't really make a difference.
Right.
Oh, and Alito.
Ugh.
Yeah. And the Voting Rights Act, again, you would think that he would be a champion of the Voting Rights Act. He's a black man. He came up from Mississippi, you know, horribly, you know, poll taxes and all kinds of ways to disenfranchise. But he's, you know, not only was he happy to kill the Section 4 in Shelby County versus Holder, he also wrote a separate concurrence saying, actually, I'd kill the Section 5 too, because we've evolved as a country. We're not the same nation we were, and we know what has happened since then. The history has continued, and all of these, you know, voter ID laws have come in and purging voters from rolls due to inactivity and you know, limiting polling places and days have all come in, again, chipping away at our fundamental right to vote. And that's how we change things, is through our vote. So yes, you must vote. You got to go out and vote. It's also really, they're trying so hard to make it our vote count less and less and less. So what can we do other than take up arms? Vote. I have to say, my biggest problem with Clarence, and I can't stand any of that other stuff, so I hate all of his decisions. I don't like, you know, I disagree with him. I disagree with his interpretation of the Constitution. I don't think that he cares about his fellow man and is not upholding, you know, liberty and justice and equality. He also married a terrible person.
Okay, this is so fun because like HILF, even though we talk about fucking, and I do talk about like a lot of people fucking in history, like I never really get into like, ooh, juicy, pop culture, what's in the news? But this Ginny Thomas girl, she is bad news. If you are deeply entrenched in history and are not current at all, Ginny Thomas is Clarence Thomas's wife. She was recently subpoenaed by the January 6th committee because she is tits deep in this stuff, man. She's everywhere. We got text messages from her. Illuminate us on more about
well, did you know Ginny was in a cult when she was younger?
No.
Yeah, she was in a cult, and she had to be deprogrammed. So she was having trouble.
I don't know if it took.
I know.
I'm not sure it took.
Life Spring was the name of.
Oh, I've heard of that.
Yeah, it was like supposed to be self-esteem boosting, but it was like these humiliation rituals where they'd like strip them naked and call them fat and stuff. Really awful stuff.
Whoa.
Anyway, so she was actually deprogrammed. So the fact that she's kind of gone down these super conspiracy lanes makes sense, actually, given her history.
Sure.
And so she was deep, and her family was super deep in the Conservative Party, and they were like worked for Goldwater, and there's this journalist, I can't remember his name, but he grew up across the street from her, and his parents were Republicans, but they were like, Ginny's family, they are crazy. They are totally nuts.
Oh.
So she's like long time nutter. Anyway, so she's married. She's this white woman. She's married to Clarence Thomas, and they are both big into grievance. And she's a lobbyist. She has a consulting firm called Liberty Consulting. And she is deep into right-wing politics, and she advocates and she lobbies, and there's people clients of hers that have matters before the Supreme Court, or they submit amicus briefs, arguing to her husband. She's being paid by them, so the money's coming into the Thomas household, and they have matters before the court. So there's these deep ethical problems with her work and what we would call the appearance of impropriety, if not direct impropriety.
But you had talked earlier about this, like what the legal standards are, because you said there's no ethics. And I think sometimes, at least for me, whenever I've encountered an ethics thing, it's a soft, sign this paper that says, we all agree that these are our ethics. Okay, great. And it's not a binding whatever. But it sounds like what you're suggesting is that there is a binding code of ethics that can instigate action that can stop and punish bad behavior. There's nothing like that on this.
Not at the Supreme Court. They don't have.
How would something like that? I mean, is there any constitutional?
Congress could pass a law requiring a binding code of ethics for the Supreme Court. They could.
But could the Supreme Court interpret that law? I mean, this is where we start to get into question with this, what we talked about at the very beginning of the balance of power. So we were not at the time able to imagine a situation where we have a truly bad actor in a branch of government.
Right.
So the Supreme Court would have to rule that it was constitutional for Congress to limit their power by ethics.
Right, and they would have, or in the converse, say it is unconstitutional for another branch of government to control us, right? So to essentially admitting that there is no check on their power. So that's a lot.
I feel like in a way this is truly humanity's rehearsal for artificial intelligence. Because if you endow a creature like the Supreme Court that is not any given thing, but is a bunch of pieces of things that operate on various systems, and you just tell that entity to regulate itself, how is that going to turn, I think, is a question that we've already admitted we lack the imagination to see how these things can go. And we don't want to legislate based on our worst fears. You don't want to set up boundaries based on everybody's worst case scenario, or you become very immovable, right? But there's got to be something in between.
Well, so different justices have they have their own circuits that they are over. So Clarence Thomas is over the 11th Circuit, and yesterday, he stopped a lower court's decision requiring Senator Lindsey Graham to testify in Georgia about Senator Graham's own efforts to intimidate the Georgia election officials. So why is this a problem? Well, because Graham's being called to testify about actions that he did. Ginny Thomas, it's been alleged that she was making very similar calls herself to Arizona electors. So Thomas is essentially stopping the inquiry into behavior that is really similar, nearly identical to behavior that his own wife was doing about January 6th and propagating this notion that Trump, this lie that Trump won the election. So that
is so close to home, man.
Some might say corrupt, it's extreme.
And it's got to be, boy, that's a sticky one, because we are talking about an entire branch of government. The accusation that they are colluding with the head of the legislative branch of government, which means the only way to really make the accusation and the only way to really fix it is to crush the beating heart of our central government. Yeah. I mean, it would mean the executive branch would have to just be like, fuck you, guy. Which they can't constitutionally. So it's, but how do you untie that knot?
I mean, you have to investigate Ginny. You really have to get it.
Who?
And
Who investigates?
Congress has to investigate. Well, I mean, I think, yeah, right. And then you have the DOJ. They're under the executive. Yeah, it's rough.
This is like your uncle started fucking your sister, and then your mom. Oh,
I know.
What do you think? Can you give me a prediction? Give me your optimistic perspective on how this works out for the best. And then give me your worst case scenario.
For the best, I think that they truly dig into Ginny Thomas, her knowledge, and if she had any advanced planning with January 6th, they look into, what has been going on with Justice Thomas. I mean, there's lots of great other alternatives to funding campaigns that would fix all of this. This great book, Unrig, by Newman is the last name of the author, and it's a graphic novel of all things. And it goes through different ways that citizens have come together and tried to fix problems in our system. And one of these is the way that we fund elections. And you can have public financed elections. That's one option where everybody gets the same amount of money, and
it's so obviously the fairest way to go. Mm-hmm. I mean, I remember my husband and I being like, why don't they just everybody gets 2 commercials, 2 hours on public radio. You can drive all over hell. You can go wherever you want personally, and that's it.
Yeah. So there are solutions, and that's kind of what, what I like to talk about, what you like to talk about, is there are solutions. We as the majority need to get ourselves together and push for those solutions.
Yeah. And I got to tell you, it's so hard. Even the possibility of having a corrupt Supreme Court does feel like watching them ice caps melt. Because every time you start being like, I'm going to get an electric car, you go, oh God, all these batteries. And then we don't have enough charging stations. And it's similar. You go, we're going to do this. We're going to pass this law. But they are the ones who hear
We're going
the
to cancel.
laws.
We're going to cancel student debt.
No.
And then a lawsuit comes in, and then one circuit won't take it, and then the 8th puts an injunction on everything, and now we're all sitting here going, well, what's going to happen?
Well, I'll tell you what's going to happen, because I am a historian. So and this is not going to be a mystery to you. Revolution is what happens. If the system isn't working, then it is either fixed or there is revolution. That is just how it works.
You're saying the word that I know in my heart of heart is the flip side of this coin that we are teetering on. I know that, and I don't want to say it out loud, but you did, and I'm glad you did. You've got kids, I've got kids.
And I know how revolutions go.
Right.
Right? It's tough when you say the word that people go, oh, you obviously want it. Oh my God. No, I don't want it. And also it isn't even about what I want. People simply do not live under a system they believe is unfair for long. And this is why it's also so insidious when you have a situation like we have where our 2 political parties live in 2 different realities.
Yeah.
Because we are sitting here talking about the necessity of revolution if your system is truly broken. And the population, the American population that stormed the Capitol on January 6th believed that same thing.
I know.
And so one is found, you're all saying the same thing, but you're literally working with a different set of facts. We're pointing to a corrupt Supreme Court that seems to be colluding with the legislature to overturn the will of the people. And they are looking at a dark, secret society that has stolen the election and is lying to everybody. These are really thin lines. These are really murky reflections, and that one is true and the other one isn't, is just, I'm telling you, historically not enough to prevent this.
Right.
We've gone through the darkness of the past, and we've covered kind of the dark cloud that we find ourselves in now. What gives you hope today that you and I and our children will be able to live in a system that we can recognize as justice?
I love the new justice. I love Ketanji Brown Jackson. I think she's great. I think she came off on fire on the court. Also, so now Sotomayor can lead, or she can walk side by side. And Elena Kagan can join as well. But we have some fierce women on the court that are not just, they're doing the work as women do, and putting their ideas out there. It is incumbent upon us as citizens to demand different. We have to push back against the Supreme Court. They will, if we allow them to just exist for the rest of our lifetime, I don't have hope that it's going to go well. We're facing, as you've been mentioning, climate change, and we're not going to push back against the fossil fuel industry without a Supreme Court that is fighting for people. So my hope is in the power of average people, like we've always done. You know, this is an eternal fight.
Yeah.
So in some ways, you know, it's always been the fight.
Yeah.
And we are just on the front lines now.
Yeah. So something about being a mom and having a young child puts a lot of these things into perspective, because when I have to just put into words what happened, you feel very quickly that's unfair. That's bullshit. That's a lie. That's manipulation. Once you are just that clear and confident on it, then I don't think it needs too much more clarity, too much more definition. That's not fair. It shouldn't be that way. And if it shouldn't, then advocate for it, right?
Absolutely. We all have one voice. How do we use it?
I use it to sing. No, I don't, and thank God. Mary Whiteside, it has been an absolute delight to have you on this podcast. I encourage everybody to go and listen to your podcast, May It Displease the Court. And if I ever really fuck up, I'm going to ask you to defend me.
Okay.
Deal?
I'll take the California bar just for you.
Thanks. I'll make sure I commit all crimes in New York, just in
Okay,
case.
perfect. Perfect.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Oh, may it please the court indeed. Oh, thanks again to Mary Whiteside. And go and listen to her incredibly informative podcast, May It Displease the Court, on Spotify. As for us, we have a new episode every other Wednesday, and the next one is very special, as my guest is my one and only mom. Aw, Lana Adams recently visited us in LA from her small town in Wisconsin, and when I asked her if she'd be a guest, not only did she say yes, she kind of had to, she assigned me a doozy. The Radium Girls. Now, these were the women who worked with glow-in-the-dark radioactive paint in the 1920s, 1930s, and then, suddenly, what seemed like one of the coolest jobs in the world turned horribly tragic. It's a great story and something of a continuation of the historical fuckery by the system you've just heard. Our theme song was composed and performed by Kat Perkins and Eric Warner. A reminder that you can find my sources, links to the books, documentaries, and articles I reference in the summary of this episode, or by emailing us, hilfpodcast@gmail.com, or messaging us on social media @hilfpodcast. This has been HILF, History I'd Like to Fuck with Dawn Brody. I'm Dawn Brody, reminding you that history is a party, and everybody's coming.